He was choking on his laughter. For the first time, after a tough battle, he could afford to relax. And Adolf laughed. Sitting in the dugout with other soldiers, he reminisced about the past. He told jokes. He didn't have time to finish. He was trembling. Adolf heard a strange voice emanating from somewhere within. It permeated every cell of the body, drowning out all other sounds. Corporal Hitler broke out in a cold sweat. The voice commanded, "Run!" The heart was pounding wildly. He ran away at a breakneck speed. The soldiers were yelling something behind his back, laughing, joking that they wouldn't leave him any dinner. But he didn't seem to hear. When Adolf regains consciousness, a horrifying black pit will be yawning at the sight of the dugout where just an hour ago they were laughing with their fellow soldiers. The bomb that fell on the fortifications killed every single soldier. All of them, except for Corporal Hitler. On that fateful night in 1914, guided by some unseen will, he left the dugout. And this will save his life.
That evening, a terrible mechanism was set in motion in the mind of Corporal Hitler. He will conclude that he is being safeguarded by some extraordinary mystical force, and that he is being preserved for something remarkable. This selfless devotion, compounded by a mental disorder, would initially lead him to power. It will transform a feeble liberator into a powerful and ruthless tyrant. This will eventually drive him mad and ultimately cause his demise.
The occult secrets of Adolf Hitler. Ritual preparation of the future leader. How and why did he actually come to power? The mystical energy with which he mesmerized the masses. The pact with the devil was made in Vienna. And Hitler's final act on Walpurgis Night. The year is 1918. He returned to Munich as a hero, with 2 high distinctions for his exploits in the war. The First World War was over. Although Germany lost the war, Adolf genuinely believed that everything would soon improve. There, in the war, he realized the true value of life. Adolf couldn't comprehend what mysterious force had spared his life. However, he was genuinely convinced that his miraculous survival during the war was not a coincidence. He returned to Munich. The city was in a frenzy. As soon as the revolution occurred in the country, the Kaiser fled, and anarchy prevailed in the streets. People didn't trust anything or anyone. They experienced the agony of defeat in the war, followed by an ensuing economic crisis. In this perplexing situation, Adolf Hitler did the only thing that seemed appropriate to him at the time. He decided to take action with his words and joined the ranks of the soldiers' agitators. He decided to discuss the war. He started explaining to others that its horrors were incomparable to the current difficulties. He stated that the Germans had the ability to rejuvenate their grand nation, capable of lifting the country from its knees. Adolf genuinely believed in this. He viewed it as his grand and noble mission. He was terribly worried. It was his turn to speak. Adolf approached the podium, inhaled deeply, and collected his thoughts.
But the intense emotions never surfaced. Hitler spoke slowly, hesitantly, and stuttered frequently. The first signs of discontent swept through the crowd. Later, there were more of them. But Hitler did not appear to react. Then the mocked aspiring speaker was simply pushed off the podium.
It was a real sorrow, shame, and pain. Hitler had never experienced such humiliation. Worm. Everything was an illusion. He believes in a lofty mission and a noble goal. Adolf felt shattered. At that moment, for the first time, he regretted not having died in the war alongside his fellow soldiers. Here in his homeland of Germany, no one needs him. He is incapable of doing anything. No job, no money, no friends, no hope for rescue. Why continue living? For what? Hitler didn't know. He was holding onto the bridge railing. His legs were trembling. Adolf was scared. He closed his eyes. The heart was pounding wildly. In a moment, it will be over. There will be no everyday horrors. Nothing. His head was spinning. He felt an unbearable pain in his temple. A peculiar, almost electric surge coursed through his body. Hitler closed his eyes and had a strange vision. A throng of thousands in the square. As if entranced, people stumbled, extending their arms forward. Hundreds of pairs of eyes were focused on the figure of a peculiar man. Hitler listened to his words. Then he heard a familiar voice.
There is another way.
Adolf looked back in fear at the strange man standing next to him. This man spoke in that voice. The same one that once saved his life. The stranger acted as if nothing had happened. He looked calm, mocking.
In vain.
These words brought Adolf back to his senses. He felt an irresistible urge to follow this passerby.
This entirely coincidental encounter would prove to be pivotal in Hitler's life. The man he encountered on the bridge was named Dietrich Eckart. He was a wealthy aristocrat. He was also a member of the secretive occult society Thule. Incredibly, just a few years later, a failed speaker who was on the verge of suicide would become the leader of this society. And then he will use it to seize power.
This evidence was discovered by Yuri Vorobyovsky, a researcher of Hitler's life. In 1993, he gained access to a special archive of the USSR. It contained documents gathered about the leadership of the Central Committee. These documents contained the names and details of Hitler's and his associates' involvement in the secret occult organization, the Germanic Order, which later became known as the Thule Society.
It is very typical that, back in those days, among the elites of these emerging occult organizations, there was the Germanic Order, its Munich branch, the Thule Society, and others, most of whom were the cultured individuals, the aristocrats, believed that a new elite was to be established. The elite of society, which is racially pure. Interestingly, these concepts and advancements were subsequently integrated into the legislation of the Third Reich.
It was 1918. At that time, Germany was undergoing a significant surge in occultism. Dozens of various secret societies operated quite legally in the country. Freemasons, Templars, Rosicrucians, Theosophists, Ariosophists, and many other mystical groups. In the midst of a widespread crisis and depression in the country, they propagated the idea of an impending Messiah who would rescue Germany and lift it from its knees. To ascertain the name of this Messiah, occultists conducted spiritualistic seances. They invoked the spirits of the past and carried out various mystical rituals. And it was in such a society, under Eckart's invitation, that the perplexed Hitler found himself. That very evening, intrigued, Adolf softly knocked on the door. The footman led him to a dark room and left him alone. Strangers entered the room and settled around the table in silence. They didn't pay any attention to Adolf, who stood bewildered by the door. It became scary. Who are all these people and what are they going to do? They clasped hands and bowed their heads. They were uttering some sort of prayer, the meaning of which Adolf could not comprehend. The volume of voices began to increase. Adolf felt dizzy. The last thing he remembered was the flickering light of the candles before everything plunged into complete darkness. He saw a crowd of thousands in the square. And people, as if mesmerized, reached out their hands to the peculiar man who towered over everyone. Who is this man and why is he seeing him again? Just a bit more, and he will recognize this person's features. Someone pushed him once and then again. And Adolf opened his eyes. The members of the society stood in a close circle around them. Hitler couldn't comprehend why these individuals were gazing at him in such a manner. A woman came out. Looking directly at Adolf, she spoke. This is the one, this is the Messiah who will transform the world. He will rejuvenate Germany. Only later was Adolf told what had happened. As it turned out, he had a seizure during the session. He lost consciousness. His body was convulsing, and the words that Hitler uttered in his unconscious state shocked everyone. He was delusional, speaking about the grand mission of the Chosen One and Germany rising from its ashes. He recited some spells, speaking in a voice different from his own. This behavior impressed the audience. The members of the society almost unanimously agreed, and indeed, he was elected in front of them. However, the power within him is still dormant. It still needs to be awakened. To unlock his hidden power, Adolf will enter a state of trance. He will learn how to conjure spirits. He will also conduct spiritual sessions and ritualistic animal sacrifices. Additionally, he will actively explore the theoretical foundation. Members of the Thule Society taught Hitler how to gesture and articulate effectively. They will instill in Adolf the ideas of Aryan blood purity and the chosen status of the German nation. Years would pass, and Hitler would perfect this knowledge. However, he would not make any progress in the most important aspect: the ability to summon and control the powerful force that lay dormant inside him. The year is 1930. Vienna. He wandered around the Vienna Historical Museum, looking at the exhibits with interest. He examined each exhibit closely, not leaving the displays for a long time. He felt a headache coming on like a wave. His heart began to pound. He leaned heavily on a small glass cabinet. He looked down. He felt numb. An ancient spear was resting on a small pillow. Hitler closed his eyes and saw a familiar vision. Thousands of people gathered in the square. Female soldiers. They were yelling someone's name like madmen, reaching out their hands to their god. The man did not seem to notice this. The intense energy that emanated from him overwhelmed everyone. And Hitler noticed that the person towering above the crowd was himself. Adolf looked up and was petrified. The man standing before him was the same one from the podium, an exact replica of him. This ghost pointed its hand at the spear and spoke.
Take it away. The truth is that the spear of Longinus was precisely the spear that was thrust into our Lord, Jesus Christ, on the cross at Calvary. That's why the following logical pattern emerges. That is, the weapon with which God himself was slain. It grants exceptional strength to its possessor. And it was this chimerical idea that so impressed Hitler when he found himself face to face with this spear. He felt as though the air was liquefying, as if something was unfolding around him. It was as though a superhero had emerged, as if his transformation occurred right at that moment. And he even offered his soul to this being that appeared before him, or rather, to this entity.
Astoundingly, Hitler himself confirmed this in his book, Mein Kampf. This is what he writes. The intense atmosphere of the museum hall seemed to blur before his eyes. I was standing alone, trembling, as the figure of a supernatural being wavered in front of me. A dangerous and lofty mind, a fearless and ruthless face. With profound reverence, I offered him my soul to become an instrument of his will. Researchers say that on that day, he made a specific deal with a mysterious voice that he managed to summon from within. It was this mysterious force that gave rise to the brutal tyrant and murderer, Adolf Hitler. And it will become the driving force on the leader's path to conquering the entire world.
A person dedicates themselves to someone, and that someone provides help. And in this case, the answer to the question of how did a minor Austrian region, such a diminutive man, unexpectedly gain such momentum? And then he was elevated to the height of human power.
The year is 1932, Germany. He stood near the podium, intensely studying people's faces. Today, he was scheduled to address the public for the first time. He was supposed to campaign as he had previously, but now on behalf of the RPR. The party, which was funded by the Thule Society, advocated the idea of the chosen German nation. He had carefully prepared for this. The previous night, Hitler had lit candles and sipped a drink from a large cup. It was a potent drug that assisted him in entering a trance state. It was not the first time he did this. In this manner, Adolf communicated with spirits, seeking assistance and support from his ancestors. Hitler's palms became cold. He remembered how the crowd had once harshly mocked him. He remembered feeling so humiliated and unwanted that he was on the verge of committing suicide. What if it's the same now? What if the power of awakening, which he owes his life to, leaves him? Thinking about it was unbearable. Hitler understood that he wouldn't survive a second failure. He could not move. Dozens of glances were focused solely on him. Adolf began to speak, initially in a sluggish manner, quietly. He stared at the crowd with a haunted look. People didn't listen. Suddenly, a wave of anger swept through his entire body. Like a madman, he burst into a scream. Adolf was trembling. Some unseen force elevated him above everyone else. This energy radiated in violent waves, seemingly capable of engulfing everything in its vicinity. He was no longer the shy, insecure Corporal Hitler. He became a man shaped by his own visions. He became powerful and omnipotent, capable of captivating the souls of millions.
Hitler almost never seriously prepared for his incendiary speeches. Well, sometimes he would only write theses, and then suddenly he'd deliver a speech that could last for hours, and what a speech it was. He comes up with all these good phrases and comparisons. It appears as though at that very moment, Hitler was being guided by someone else's will. It even seemed to suggest something to him, and it provided him with additional strength.
Suddenly, Hitler realized. The clandestine power that had controlled him during the war was far more potent than anything he had learned from the Thule Society. And most importantly, this power to which he devoted his soul will elevate him to authority. The year is 1933, Germany. A squad of armed soldiers stormed a small printing house in Munich. They removed the manuscripts and printed copies of the book by the German author Rudolf von Siebettendorf from publication. It was titled Before Hitler Came. The Germans never learned its content. The book's distribution was halted, and its publishers were arrested by the Gestapo. But why?
The truth is that the book discussed the activities of the secretive Thule Occult Society. Among its members, the notorious names of the Reich's top brass, such as Heinrich Himmler, Rudolf Hess, and Alfred Rosenberg, were prominently mentioned. At the helm of the society, the book assured us, was the Grand Master of Thule, Adolf Hitler.
The book Before Hitler Came was immediately prohibited. Everyone involved in writing it was arrested. Members of the Thule Society, the very society that once assisted Hitler in rising to power, were not exempt from oppression.
It was interesting to note that at the level of official doctrine, the occult was not welcomed in the Third Reich. It was practically banned. Indeed, it was understood that this knowledge was intended solely for a select group of individuals who were expected to lead the nation.
Thus, in 1933, Hitler commanded the dissolution of all German occult societies, and instead established 50 secluded institutes of the Ahnenerbe order. It was a clandestine occult organization. Here, scientists, astrologers, and esoteric scholars dedicated to the Reich studied arcane occult subjects. They conducted experiments on human psyche. But the main task of Ahnenerbe was to find a way to rapidly breed a pure Aryan race of superhumans. Hitler was in a rush. He was nearing 50 years old, and he had to accomplish what no one else could. To change the world. This world was created under his guidance and before his very eyes. The entire country, unknowingly, was slowly turning into a massive secret society.
The attributes of this order were ubiquitous. They were on the runes of the uniforms worn by Wehrmacht and SS soldiers. The Thule symbol, the swastika, congratulations on the victory of Sieg Heil. Hitler modified it from the Thule members' greeting, Heil und Sieg. Additionally, during moments of victory, Hitler frequently used the Grand Master's gesture of crossed arms. They symbolized the runes of Dagaz, and in the language of the occult, they represented the ultimate power over the world of the living and the dead.
Every SS officer was awarded a unique ring, known as the Death's Head. Depending on the mission, the corresponding runes were inscribed on this ring by the Führer. The Halseichen rune was a symbol of prosperity and luck. The Toten rune was a symbol of death and was inscribed on the gravestones of deceased Nazis. The Hegel rune symbolized the sanctity of faith in SS mythology and was even bestowed upon newlyweds. After the owners passed away, these rings were returned to the castle, the primary occult center of the Third Reich. With the use of these mystical artifacts, the Nazis intended to revive the spirits of their deceased heroes. Henceforth, all marriage ceremonies in Germany were conducted by initiated members of the SS. The couple took their vows in front of a portrait of Hitler. In the churches from which the Catholic priests were expelled, members of the secret society Ahnenerbe conducted the services. Soon, children in schools began to sing hymns to the canonized Hitler. In his visions, he saw a majestic Berlin adorned with obelisks and a central temple, akin to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Under Hitler's directive, architects even prepared a relevant project for the city's reconstruction. It was to be completed by 1950, the year when Germany was to become the ruler of the world with its capital, the Eternal City, the sanctuary of souls, Berlin. Vienna. A group of SS men entered the Vienna History Museum. They strolled through the corridors of the museum and paused in the section of royal jewels. By the command of the SS, museum staff opened the display case where the tip of the Spear of Destiny was stored. That same evening, a member of the Occult Thule Society, Reichsfuhrer Heinrich Himmler, solemnly presented the Führer with a gift from Vienna. Hitler shakily took the ancient relic in his hands. He could not contain his excitement. The sovereign spear finally belonged to him. He put on a robe and drew a large circle on the room floor. Hitler walked into the center and knelt before a fragment of an ancient spear. He recited an ancient prayer. A knife gleamed in his hands. Blood flowed from Hitler's fingers, dripping onto the spear blade, gradually covering its surface. As if spellbound, he gazed at the bloody stains that shifted, creating peculiar images. He saw human faces contorted with pain, heard someone's screams. He witnessed cities engulfed in flames and the German flag soaring over the towers of places unknown to him. And Hitler realized that the time had come. Germany will rise from the ashes. It will conquer the entire world. It will become the most powerful nation on earth, a nation of superhumans governed by him, the Messiah. After this pivotal event, Hitler initiated a war against the entire world. The success of this war impressed everyone. In 1938, Germany annexed Czechoslovakia. In 1939, it invaded Poland, and in 1940, it occupied the territory of France. Hitler's meetings with his covert superior became more frequent, and the voice commanded him to push further east. He could not resist this urge, and in 1941, he gave the fatal order to march into the USSR.
Indeed, there are peculiar aspects in Hitler's biography. In his book, Mein Kampf, he stated that an assault on Russia would be equivalent to suicide for Germany, yet he surprisingly launched an attack. He held all the power, free to do as he pleased, which is why he attacked. Thus, such a will, which directs the course of certain natural human impulses, exists. This will is characterized differently across various scientific disciplines, including theology.
Эта воля описана и в различных научных дисциплинах по-разному.
He woke up in a cold sweat. Adolf was well acquainted with this condition, as he had induced it numerous times himself. In a moment, he will hear a familiar voice. That voice will provide him with guidance, instruct him on what actions to take, and he, Hitler, will heed it, as he always has. But this time, something went wrong. He threw himself into the corner of the room, wrapped his arms around his head as if it was about to explode. Pain seized him with iron claws. He had never felt so terrible. But the worst part was that the voice did not come this time. Like a slug, he crawled across the floor, pleading with his unseen companion to return. He wept like a child, but to no avail, that voice never resurfaced. In the morning, Hitler received the dreadful news that the plan for a swift attack on Russia, the Blitzkrieg, had failed. In the Battle of Moscow, German forces suffered a significant defeat, the first in the history of the Führer's reign. It was a significant setback for Hitler. The hidden strength had deserted him, and now he had tasted defeat for the first time. He lost because he couldn't hear the mysterious voice, which was drowned out by unbearable pain. But what was the cause of this pain? Where did they originate from, and what was their reason? What was the source of the mysterious voice that influenced Hitler's decisions, and why did it ultimately become silent? It's hard to believe, but contemporary researchers studying Hitler's life have unraveled this mystery. According to the records of Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Morell, Hitler suffered from schizophrenia. But that's not all. After analyzing this data and combining it with obscure facts from Hitler's life, experts made a sensational discovery.
In psychiatry, the Kandinsky-Clerambault syndrome is recognized. Some individuals, for various reasons, abruptly start to perceive another will within themselves. Sometimes it is even a voice that suggests something. The main feature that Kandinsky wrote about is that quite often a person's own will cannot resist the will of others, and sometimes even a complex array of different wills.
What Hitler perceived as divine providence was actually influenced by his disturbed consciousness, which merely found fertile ground to thrive. This group turned out to be the secretive Thule Society, whose members viewed Hitler as a messiah, as well as the Führer's steadfast belief in his grand mission.
The patient may experience insomnia. The patient begins to articulate certain thoughts, which are linked to hallucinations. Pseudo-hallucinations, to clarify, are different from genuine hallucinations. When he perceives what others cannot, it transforms into delusional thoughts. The essential characteristic of the Kandinsky-Clerambault syndrome is the presence of these delusional thoughts, or delusions. These can be delusions of persecution, delusions of influence, delusions of grandeur, among others.
The severe pains that Hitler began experiencing were actually the second stage of a serious mental illness.
But the absence of a guiding voice, the Führer will interpret in his own way. Unable to muster the inner strength, Hitler will cease to deliver his renowned speeches and will come to the conclusion that his unseen master requires recompense for his protection, and this recompense will later become millions of human casualties.
times, can you believe it? As a doctor, I understand the effects when I prescribe one medication. I know how it functions. When I prescribe two medications, I consider their interactions and the subsequent effects on the patient's body. But when I prescribe three, I struggle to fully comprehend.
An individual who transitions from a stimulant to vitamin complexes, in this case we're discussing Hitler, to oxygen, also exerts a significant impact on the body. This not only alters the immune status, but also has a neuroprotective property, meaning it affects nerve cells. Then he stopped taking amphetamines because he fell into depression.
As a result of such therapy, Hitler's condition deteriorated daily. He became even more suspicious and nervous. Starting in 1943, the Führer drove his generals into a frenzy by capriciously altering the plans of the general staff. He did not want to listen to any warnings. The once invincible army was now retreating. It was encircled by Allied troops and Soviet units from all directions. Every general in the Wehrmacht ranks already knew what the end would be. Everyone except Hitler, who still believed in Germany's victory.
Hitler made multi-million sacrifices, and having done so, became expendable to his diabolical overseer. This is the typical fate of, let's say, a high-ranking sorcerer. When he played his role, after all, the devil is ruthless, especially towards his servants. He has no gratitude or mercy for anyone. He just discards it like a dirty rag.
Hitler did not comprehend this. That is why he started searching for a substitute for this voice. And for this, he surrounded himself with magicians, psychics, and astrologers, individuals whom he typically disregarded. At Hitler's command, scientists from Ahnenerbe analyzed the course of the war and attempted to attribute the actual failures of the Wehrmacht to mystical causes. For instance, in 1943, Luftwaffe planes were unable to penetrate Oxford's defenses. Meanwhile, at Ahnenerbe, they initiated investigations into the enigma of the Oxford Cathedral, whose bells were allegedly endowed with magical properties that protected the city. When the British started sinking German submarines in large numbers, the occultists alleged that the enemy was utilizing a unique pendulum, swinging it over the map to pinpoint the precise coordinates of the German submarines. Since then, pendulums have been used in Wehrmacht tanks. Gradually, the Institute of German Occult Research was taken over by magicians and psychics. They tried to determine the ship's location from photographs. Using the vines, they searched for lost or captured German generals and even established active contacts with Tibetan monks. At the same time, 1,000 Tibetan monks arrived in Berlin. They were tasked with creating an impenetrable dome of protection over the city, but this did not occur. During one of the sessions, a Soviet bomb fell on the house where the monks were residing. This marked the completion of the rituals to create an impenetrable dome over Berlin. It was April 1945. The circle around Berlin tightened every day. But Hitler did not believe that it was all over. Ill, shattered, pushed to insanity, the Führer continued to wait for salvation. He was writhing in pain, clawing at his face, pleading for his unseen companion to help.
But the miracle did not occur. On the night of April 20th, 1945, the Führer was deserted by nearly all Nazi leaders, and on April 22nd, he was notified that the Russians had penetrated Berlin. Hitler received the messages but chose to stay behind to defend the city with his own forces. But in reality, the reason was different. He was waiting for the 30th of April.
In the final days of April, irrational orders began to emerge from the bunker. Hitler ordered the destruction of Berlin, the demolition of bridges, and the flooding of the subway, where 200,000 civilians, primarily women and children, took refuge from the bombings. He ordered his brother-in-law to be killed, along with his dog. He received a promise from Goebbels that he would also sacrifice himself and his family. On the morning of April 29th, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. He needed her to conduct a mysterious ceremony that was supposed to take place at night. Meanwhile, the American army entered Nuremberg. According to esoteric scholars from the USA, there was a concealed entity that empowered and protected Hitler. The soldiers were tasked with finding this object. On the 30th of April, in the afternoon, Hitler felt a weakness throughout his entire body, as if his life force was gradually draining away. He understood that a miracle wouldn't occur. It's all over.
At this moment in Nuremberg, American soldiers from the 7th Army discovered a hiding place in the castle wall. They unwrapped a carefully rolled package and were surprised to discover it was the tip of an ancient spear. It was the Spear of Destiny which Hitler once seized in Vienna.
Exactly 1 hour later, a gunshot echoed in a bunker in Berlin. The bodies of Eva Braun and Adolf Hitler were carefully wrapped by the guards. At night, they were taken out of the bunker upstairs, doused in gasoline, and set on fire. Everything, as the Führer instructed them before his death. The only thing that the guards were unaware of was that this night, transitioning from April 30th to May 1st, was special. It was Walpurgis Night, the primary celebration of Satanists.